Hey there, welcome to Blockhead, the Peanuts tribute podcast from a cartoonist's point of view. My name is Jeff Grogan, and I will be your host for the next few minutes to talk about Peanuts, Charles Schulz, and all things Charlie Brown, Linus, Lucy, and Snoopy too. So sit back and enjoy. Hey there, welcome to another episode of Blockhead. It is our second episode of 2020, and as promised, we have part two of our marathon-length interview with Rick Stromoski, the creator of the wonderfully funny comic strip Soup to Nuts, which, recall, was in the newspapers from 2000 to 2018, a good 18-year run, and is now running on Patreon as Andrew. So be sure to go to Patreon and check out Rick Stromoski there and sign up. Send him $1 a month and you'll get some wonderful comics every other day. The story of Andrew continues on Patreon. So we pick up this conversation right where it left off. Rick and I were talking about some of the frustrations of the education of artists, and one of the things that Rick was emphasizing was the need for young artists, particularly young freelance illustration, comics, cartooning artists, but also all kinds of other artists, to have a background in business. And I have to second that. I believe that's absolutely imperative, and I'll tell you why. Because I didn't have it. I didn't have it, and there were a lot of mistakes made along the way. I still don't have a business sense at all, which is why I ended up, I think, in part in academia, because I don't have a business sense. It's just terrible. I'm just one of those guys, you know. I fail at all of those things, and even when it comes to social media and stuff, I cannot catch up. I just terrible. So anyway, so that other young artists don't end up like me. The idea that an educational facility for artists would include business is a good idea. I do have to say, in our defense, that we try, and I work with a lot of great people at Adelphi University, where I teach in Garden City, New York, and they're a terrific group of educators and artists. They are absolutely wonderful, and many of them are much smarter than I am on this issue, and they impart that information to their students as best they can, and we do try. So I just want to, I don't want to undercut what Rick is saying. I think it's very important, but I also to just kind of assuage the fears of parents out there who might be listening and who may have a budding artist in the household. Listen, we do our best to impart as much as we can to our students, both in terms of technique and in terms of ideas, and in terms of problem solving, and in terms of navigating the art world as much as we can. And I'm saying that out of a sense, not out of a sense of loyalty or a need to defend academia, because I think there are a lot of issues with academia, and the cost certainly is a big one, really a big one, and it's something that I'm concerned with, and my colleagues are concerned with at Adelphi. And but having said that, we also, we do try to guide our students as best we can, because we care, and we care about the next generation and making sure that they carry forth the torch of art, but also that they have healthy and happy lives. That's really the goal, healthy and happy lives. And can't ask for any more than that, and we try our best. And but these are good discussions, really good discussions. And Rick and I get into even some more interesting discussions that we don't always necessarily agree on, but it's great to hear another point of view and to talk to somebody about another point of view. For example, the discussion about newspapers and peanuts on the newspaper page and legacy strips. And I understand Rick's point. You'll hear it in a discussion coming up, and I think there's merit to his point, but I'd also hate to see a comics page without peanuts on it. So that's an ongoing discussion. But I do think that we get into, this is something we've talked about a lot, and you'll hear what I have to say later on, but I think it's time for, in order to maintain the health of the medium in that venue, some kind of reimagining has to take place. And what that means, I'm not exactly sure, because I'm not, I'm not one of those people in a position to determine that. So anyway, so this is a great discussion. It covers a lot of territory, and we talk about newspapers, and we talk about comics, we talk about Charles Schulz and Peanuts, and we talk about religion and Catholicism, because we both come from that. And I think it's just, you're going to find it, I hope you'll find it, as interesting as it was to both Rick and I. So without further ado then, let's get to it. Rick Stromoski and myself in conversation.
I've had hundreds of art directors since 1983 that have used me. Not one of them has ever asked me where I went to school or what my grade was. How were my grades? Where'd you go to school? Not one ever asked me that question.
It's the portfolio. What kind of work you do, what kind of discipline you have, exactly. How reliable you are, yep. How above board your business practices are. And I think that...
Yeah, and I always stress, and I speak to kids all the time, and I tell them how important it is to meet deadlines. One of the things I tell them is, I tell the story about buying mailing lists and spending all this money you have to spend money to make money. But if you have to always make your deadlines. And I tell kids, your teachers aren't doing this, just so make it easier for them. It makes it easier for you in your future, because imagine spending all this time promoting yourself to these different markets, and one finally decides to hire you after 6 times, getting a postcard from you, and you're late on your deadline. You've thrown that whole, production schedule off, because they don't care if your dog ate it or if you got shot in the leg. I mean, the work has to be there when it has to be there. And do you think that art director will ever hire you again? And they won't. They will never, ever hire you again. So
this is what I tell kids when we're doing assignments, whether it's for an illustration class or it's for something else. The assignment has to be in on time. If you were doing this for business, there's no I overslept, or I've got a lot of other homework to do. I mean, that's not it. Just doesn't matter. And the other thing that I think is really important for them to understand too is, particularly when they start, a lot of kids will put stuff out and go, well, it would be better, except that I blah blah blah, whatever excuse, it'd be better than this, or I'm not really happy with that. And that just doesn't cut it, because an audience, or whether it's an audience that is a professional audience like a publisher, or it is your audience out in Instagram, does not care why it's not as good as it should be. That does not mitigate anything. If it's not as good as it should be, they pass by it and go on to the next thing, and forget about you. And that's something that has to be ingrained, and you can't really forget. It's a professional attitude. These are big issues. You're going to have to be careful, because I just might reach out to you to come and lecture for one of my classes at one point.
I'd love to. That's fun.
Yeah, because I think this is a really interesting and important topic. Business practices, professional practices for commercial art, as well as for fine art, are really important, because I agree with you. The more students who are aiming towards the fine art world learn how to navigate the commercial world and to augment what they're doing with commercial work, the more artists we're going to see, the more successful artists we're going to see. And I think it's really important to grapple with this stuff. But I want to also go back, because I think it is really impressive that you are a self-taught artist. You're an artist who did not go to art school, and you found your way. And obviously, you were really smart and really motivated and really driven in ways that a lot of people, I think, like, I know for myself, I would send stuff out and not get responses, just as you're saying. And I would just fold up like a leaf, in the fall, and crumble, because I feel like I was stepped on. I was no good, and that was that. And take those rejections to heart, and then I couldn't do anything after that, because my self-esteem or my drive or my imagination, and that's really comes down to my imagination wasn't strong enough to survive or to make myself successful in that field. And so I really admire how you've begun your career and how you built your career. But I also admire your skill as a cartoonist. And I think one of the things that I'd really like to examine a little bit is your drawing style, your cartooning, what your influences are, how you put that together, and where that came from. Because I find you draw, as Charles Schultz said, you draw really funny and beautifully designed characters that are just hilarious. And you don't even have to read the strip to know it's funny. Where did all of that come from? Drawing characters that are really hilarious to look at and really entertaining. There's a lot of influences in there that you've put together to create something that's entirely your own.
Yeah, Mad was instrumental. I mean, I liked the comics pages growing up. I particularly liked Bill Holman, who did Smokey Stover. The sheer wackiness of it. It's just there was so much going on visually in his strip. I didn't actually get it. Sometimes it was kind of abstract, like Zippy the Pinhead is. Bill strip is very abstract, but what Bill does is just, to me, phenomenal. What he can put in a comic strip and have it be legible at that size is just how much work he puts into those. Why he's not won a Reuben Award to me is just astounding to me. But he's an artist, and but my influences really primarily came from Mad. I loved, not only did I love, the drawing in Mad and the fact that there were, 15, different cartoonists pretty much in there. And they were all different. They all drew differently. I loved how Jack Davis drew sports figures, because I wanted to be a sports illustrator when I was younger, and I learned how to draw, sports, football players and baseball players, through Jack, and the movement, and like he could actually draw, the way he drew shoes. I mean, nobody draws shoes like Jack Davis. His shoes have muscles on them, right? They were just a really interesting way and his cross hatching was great. And Mort Drucker's caricature work was astounding to me. And I loved Sergio's margins. And when Sergio got, sometimes Sergio would get a 3-page spread of something with a theme. And I loved that, because then now you could see how he draws bigger, as opposed to getting a magnifying glass and seeing how he, drew these tiny little margin things. And when I was a kid, I thought he drew that tiny. I said, boy, that's really great. He could draw this detail so small. But and Don Martin's hands and feet, like Don Martin's characters would be walking towards you and his foot would be folded in half and it looks perfectly normal. That kind of, I just loved the artists in there and how they drew and how they thought and how they just, their characters came alive and the movement. And so those are my influences. So I would practice, I would copy their stuff. I would trace their stuff. And I just incorporated all those things, into, my own style. And I kind of draw in several different styles. I mean, I depending on my mood or, what I want to paint or draw is will dictate it. But I just kind of just paid attention to all those little details. And I think we all do that as cartoonists. We pay attention to those details and we say, oh, that's how you draw this. So that's how you draw that. And I just put it together, and that's kind of how it all came about.
I think what you got in your work is completely your own. So it's evolved and taken all these things and put them together, and they've come out with your own sensibility shaping them. But I can also see, when you talk about Mad Magazine, I can see Sergio in your work, and I can see Don Martin in particular. Those two guys, I can see that kind of quality, your line quality, and also the exaggerations of form. While you don't draw, Don Martin had a particular way of dealing with the human form and the human figure that's very Don Martin and very recognizable. And you don't mimic that at all. But I can see that sense of love of exaggeration that's in Martin, and sound effects and whatnot in Soup to Nuts. It's and in terms of the paintings that you're doing now, I love them, and they also remind me of Don Martin too, in the best way possible. They're still yours, but yeah, you can see this guy loved Don Martin and loved Sergio Aragonés. They're there.
And to be able to meet them, I never met Don Martin, but to meet Sergio, and these guys were my heroes. And now that I've been in the NCS for such a long time, I mean, the fact that they know who I am, and they, we can sit down and have a conversation. It's just, you have these heroes of of your childhood, and then they become your friends. It's just like an amazing gift. And but I loved Mad particularly too, but not just, the art was always fantastic and primary for me, but I loved the irreverence of it. I loved how Mad there were no sacred cows that were unapproachable. They made fun of everything. They made fun of the Pope. They made fun of politics and popular culture and television shows. And you'd see you watch a show that's so wholesome and wonderful like the Waltons, and there it is in Mad being completely skewered. And I just love that idea, or the fact that you can even draw the Pope. Growing up Catholic,
yeah,
mortal sin. But here you got the Pope riding a donkey or something. It just, or even Jesus. And just the stuff that they would do is just. I mean, in fact, growing up in my house, Mad Magazine was something that you get your ass beat if you were reading Mad. Just you have to hide it like a Playboy. It would be.
Yeah.
So I just loved it. But
I teach a history of comics class, and one of the things that I think that I try to impress on kids when we get to talking about the 50s is how groundbreaking Mad Magazine was in terms of satire, in terms of its sense of humor, and in terms of the idea that all of a sudden there were no sacred cows, that you could make fun of everything and not take everything seriously. That was not, a big part of popular culture. Prior to that, our institutions were held in high regard and rarely parodied, at least in popular media. Mad Magazine, Harvey Kurtzman, Wally Wood, Bill Elder, all those guys, Al Feldstein, all of them, broke open doors. I don't know if you heard the show I did with Ryan Flanders from Mad Magazine, but when Mad was first announced that Mad was ending its run of original material, we had a big show with Ryan and talked a lot about Mad, the history of it and whatnot. And its impact through my childhood, and you and I are roughly the same age. We, both in the close to 60 range, you're just over it, I guess. But happy birthday, by the way. But for us growing up, Mad Magazine was a kind of crucible, you went through as a kid. And it was something that was shared among friends in secret. And it was an important point of transition, I think, for a lot of folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And as well as National Lampoon.
Oh, my God, yeah.
National Lampoon, Gay Wilson, and the Cartoonist and Playboy. I mean, my brothers were older than me, so occasionally come across a Playboy between a mattress or in the basement, or I'd read the articles first, and then but I was always drawn to the comic art. Yeah, the comic art was just amazing. The humor in it, the drawings of Kurtzman's Little Annie Fanny. It was sexy, but it was beautifully drawn. I remember just reading those comics and thinking, not just looking at how erotic it was, but the fact that it was so well drawn. This is a comic that's just just amazing to me. And the big full page comics and then the quarter page black and whites, and just Jack Bill, I think it was Bill Dempsey, or I forget his name, but he had the old woman or Buck Brown's old woman cartoons, and Whitney Darrow's watercolor, and the broad brush strokes, and it was like Mad. There was so many different ways of cartooning in those things. And
Jeff was a cartoonist himself.
Yes, he was.
And had a great deal of appreciation for comics. He knew what he liked, and comics were something that he really liked. And his page rate was one of the best going.
Yes, they were. Yeah.
And so he supported a lot of folks, a lot of cartoonists, as did magazines in general. And that's one of the kind of the sad things, as the magazine and print industry has kind of died, is that marketplace for cartoonists and great cartoonists, has shrunk. And not entirely gone, but it's shrunk a great deal. I mean, Playboy stopped carrying cartoons a number of years ago, I think, now, which was a sad moment, I think. Just one of the big markets.
Yeah, and it's really to see cartoonists like Gan Wilson, recently passed away. In the manner that he, the lack of work that he's had, in recent years. It's just a shame because he's a giant. He will always.
Sure.
The fact that modern publishing can't appreciate someone like Ann Wilson and keep him work, it was, to me, kind of scary. That you see cartoonists that used to be everywhere. are not there anymore. They're just not getting the work that they really deserve to have. But that's a whole nother discussion.
Well, it is. But actually, maybe it's a topic for a show, particularly with the generation of cartoonists wherein cartoonists did not own their own material, as you're talking about King Features or with other syndicates, signing away copyrights, things of that nature. There's a whole generation of cartoonists who had no retirement plan, who were working check to check with no kind of security whatsoever, no health care, no nothing. These are people we revere,
Right. Yeah, and we have great memories of and stories of, and people who have actually helped and mentored people. One of the things that I've discovered, when I become a professional cartoonist, how willing other cartoonists are to help other cartoonists, and like send them, markets to target or get them work or share, information with them. It's weird because we're all in competition with one another, but we help each other. It's against working against our own best interests. But I've never met a cartoonist that was just a negative. I've always found them as friendly, because we're helpful people, because we're very excited about what we do. I mean, we're really passionate about what we do and how amazing it is that we get paid to put our little doodles on pieces of paper and make a living from it. And anybody who can do that, I have nothing but respect for. Whether I like their feature or not, it's like going back to the art director. Thousand art directors, you're never going to please everyone.
No.
But if you're making a living at it and you're doing it, and that to me is astounding to me. I have nothing but respect for that.
Oh, same here. Yeah, same here. I think it's so hard to make a living in the arts in general. When I first had my first failures and struggles, all of the kind of youthful arrogance that I had fell away, and I just became very inspired and in awe of artists who particularly artists like yourself, for example, who found their own way and built their own career one step at a time on their own two legs. I mean, it's really a difficult world to navigate, and certainly anybody who's done it gets my respect, that's for sure, because I think it's a difficult thing to do. But anybody who wants to do it too. I've talked to several different cartoonists who've been very helpful, such as yourself. Ray Billingsley goes out of his way to help younger cartoonists, and of course Charles Schultz did too, and we're passing a baton. In my own way, I do it as a teacher, and I think it's really important to think not in terms of just myself as a teacher, but and as an artist, but that art is something that lives on beyond each. It's bigger than just an individual artist. It's about a continuum, and handing that baton off to somebody else. That's really important, because that's what it's about,
Another cartoonist that was amazing in that regard was Mort Walker. He helped dozens of cartoonists find work. He got them work because he had a lot of pull. He through King Features and some of his publishing connections, he would find out about a cartoonist who needed a job, and he would find them a job for them. And he was just really magnanimous in that way, and never asked for anything in return. He was like your long lost uncle. And people denigrate Beetle Bailey and some of the stuff that he's done, but the guys, the strip's older than me.
Yeah,
and,
I know.
It's got legs. It's got reasons to do it, and it's still in the marketplace. I have nothing but respect for it, and the work is new. I mean, even it's now a legacy strip. The Sons are doing it. They're still putting out quality work. They're still consistent with it, and as long as the marketplace says we want you there, like my only thing that I have a problem with, and this might rub you the wrong way, but strips that no longer are putting out new material that are taking up real estate on the page. I think that's what's killing the comics. There's here in Hartford, there's 4 comics that are just they're being done by artists that don't create any new work. I mean, Peanuts. If you want to read Peanuts, there's thousands of anthologies you can read. I mean, what used to bother me when I opened the paper and I'd see a Peanut strip and it mentions Peggy Fleming. I mean, who knows who Peggy Fleming is that's under 50 years old? I mean, there was, in fact, they even had a Sam Snead reference, a golfing cartoon. Sam Snead was the 1940s, 1950s. Or I mean,
Yeah.
it would be like watching, network TV, turning it on a Thursday night at 8 o'clock, and you're watching the Dick Van Dyke Show from 1960s.
It's great to watch Dick Van Dyke if you're you and me. That's one thing. But maybe it's okay for younger people too. But I take what you're saying. I don't take offense at it at all, because I think it's a topic well worth discussing.
I can see a financial aspect, that it's a cash cow. It makes millions of dollars for the syndicate and Peanuts. It'd be stupid to give that up. I understand that. But from the artistic point of view, from the what is good for comics, what is good for newspaper comics, it's awful.
Well, and I think the issue too comes down to also newspaper comics in general. We were just talking about the syndicates and their business practices and all of that, and how it all works. And there are some. There's some difficulties there, and there's some difficulties in the publishing industry. I think that it's ripe for reinvention at this point. And I know that I listen to Comics Lab with Brad Geiger and Dave Kellett, and I've talked about them a lot on this show. And they've made a living as web comics artists, and they've been very successful in a lot. And I know a number of people have followed in their footsteps and do it. And they point a certain kind of business model. I don't know that it works for everybody. It certainly, doesn't always. And I think there have got to be other ways of utilizing mass market media, not just social media and individuals working in social media, but mass market media somehow. The way the comics page functioned in the newspaper, I think there's got to. It's ripe for if the comic strip, as we're talking about it, is going to continue to be a viable, vital part of daily life. How its dissemination one way or another, I think, has to be reinvented. It's in a process of being reinvented, but I think it's well worth, a lot of people saying, well, this isn't working anymore. We've got to find another viable mode of communicating this material, of disseminating this material.
Right.
And talking about legacy strips is an important part of it.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know what the answer is, but I've had the same discussion since the 90s. This is since I started as a professional cartoonist. So it's no easy answers, but it is evolving for sure.
And some of the folks who might listen to the show might immediately be offended by the idea of, say, removing Peanuts from the and all legacy strips. I mean, if you're going to remove Peanuts, you're going to remove those other comics that are not new material and other things as well. I think Peanuts would probably be the last one to go, but I think it would show that the comics page is not
the first one to go.
It should be.
There's been no new material for 20 years.
Yeah, I know. And
most
one
of
the things
also what you see is from the 60s, or actually from the late 60s to the early 70s or early 80s. You're looking at strips that are 50, 30 years old. At least Beetle Bailey, it's all new material that you're seeing every day. And I understand Lynn Johnston wanting to but everything you're seeing, for better for worse, is rehashed. Get Fuzzy, the dailies of Get Fuzzy are rehashed.
And you were gonna I know you too were gonna run reprints of Soup to Nuts, but then you didn't, or you stopped after a little while.
I never did. I didn't do any.
You didn't do it. It was just something that was just thrown out there as an idea.
Yeah, no, I just never did. I don't think there's even time to do it, but I just I don't know. I think that I can, like I said earlier, it's for as a monetary. It's almost like the energy companies. You're not going to give up oil and go right into solar, because you're still making money off this oil, but it's damaging the environment. It's damaging, what we're doing. And I think that running comics and that you can easily get in anthologies, it does damage to the new readers that you're trying to bring in. I mean, you're not going to bring in new readers to read,
Yeah.
rehashed, comics.
Right. I think this is a viable topic for discussion, and I think absolutely it's I think reinvention is the name of the game in terms of the comics page, but also in terms of newspapers in general. For years, I say this all the time. I did a lot of collage work with the original New York Times material, the daily New York Times newspaper that I bought, and it was part of what I was doing. I used just the Times to make a lot of different stuff, and I don't even get to I get the New York Times on my computer now. I don't bother. Of course, I live in upstate and it's harder, but that's not the point. The point is simply it's too convenient, to get it digitally. And so I think when you're talking about who's reading the newspaper, who's actually reading, my local newspaper is moribund. I mean, it's just god awful. It's $2 an issue. And it's all either advertisements or no local news whatsoever, and it's a chain. It's part of a larger chain, and it's just, I hate to say it, it's $2 wasted if you were going to buy it. And
I think that's
so
are making their mistakes is they're focusing on the wrong things.
I agree.
Local news is where why people would buy a newspaper. We in the town I live in, Suffield, we have this local paper. It comes out once a month. It's a broadsheet. It's about 50 pages, but it's all about Suffield. It's everything about Suffield. It's mailed free to everyone. Everyone's house comes the first of the month every month. I do an editorial cartoon for it, but it is the most popular thing in town, and people want to read about what's going on in their town. They want to see things they can't get on the internet or right on the broadcast news. Newspapers, by the time you get it in the morning, by the time the Hartford Courant lands in my driveway, all that news that's been printed, I've already seen it last night on the news, or I saw it yesterday afternoon on the internet. So why do I want to read it again? So what can newspapers do to make them viable? Well, you have to give them features. Features are what sells the papers. Comics sells the papers. Certain writers will sell a newspaper. And a local news. People want to read about what's happening here in Hartford. They want to find out what's going on in Hartford. They got rid of the town section. They eliminated the number one thing that people would buy the paper for is gone. And they do have a very viable comics page. I have to give them credit. There's like 40 comics in the Hartford Courant. But it's a mindset throughout the industry, and they're doing it completely backwards.
I agree with you about this idea of a monthly or a weekly that deals more with local news, that has local journalists and local reporters. We had a thriving, and longtime listeners will have heard this discussed before, but we had a history of journalism here in my upstate New York home. 2 newspapers. There were probably more than that for my time, but with local journalists, well-known journalists, revered actually, people who wrote columns for 50 years, and there's none of that now. There was a guy named David Rossi. He was a local journalist. He wrote a column. He was a reporter, went through the reporter thing, and he was a local journalist for 50 years. And he was revered. Great guy. Nobody ever filled his shoes. There was nobody groomed to fill his shoes. And we just don't have the investment in local journalism now, and we've lost a lot in that way. And I think that's one way in which local newspapers can reinvent themselves. People need to know about what's going on at their school board meeting or at their town, or I mean, these are
why this paper does really well in Suffield, and it relies solely on advertising dollars, and it's a completely viable paper. It pays all its bills, actually runs a profit. So
it's great.
All the staff is volunteer, but it's a viable paper. I mean, it's a good model for it to show conventional papers what works, and they're not doing so.
So let's get back to you a little bit, because I think, I still want to get back to your work and where you're coming from. Bill Holman, Smokey Stover, we used to get that. It's another example of a great old strip that not too many people talk about, but I love this. I never saw dailies. I always saw the Sunday, though. And I love, that's one of those strips I loved as a kid, was Smokey Stover, because it was so whacked out.
Yeah, exactly. I love Smokey Stover. I mean, I liked Peanuts. to some extent. But I like Peanuts in print, in book form, more than I liked it in newspaper form, because in the paper it was just so minimal, and newsprint isn't a very good reproduction of what you're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I saw Peanuts outside of the paper, it was in a book called The Gospel According to Peanuts.
Oh, I had that book too.
Yeah, my mother was a theologian, and she was totally into religion. And this book, I remember looking at it and seeing, as you know, there's peanut strips, sporadically placed throughout the book.
Yeah.
When talking about different aspects of religion, and but the printing on it was so crisp, and the blacks were so black, and you could really see the cross hatching that Sparky did, and it was the first time I really was drawn to the art of Peanuts. And it was slightly larger than you'd see in the paper. So that was my first real, and the strips in that book were some of his absolute best. I mean, they were absolutely hysterical. Where most of the dailies I thought were kind of trite and cute, but not really. It didn't really draw me in like other comics did. But
Which, by the way, I thought it's kind of interesting, because I got the sense when I looked at some of the stuff about you online that you mentioned all these other influences, and Peanuts was not mentioned. And I thought, well, this is going to be interesting, because it'd be kind of cool to talk to somebody who's not really intuitively drawn to that kind of sensibility. And so I kind of wanted to hear from you some of your critique of Peanuts, because I think it's kind of interesting to hear from somebody who is maybe not as enamored of it as, say, I am, for example.
Well, I think it was a phenomenal strip. I mean, the things that Sparky did were unheard. Like, he had these just these flagship moments, in the strip. Creating these, the Red Baron, the Great Pump, Schroeder's piano, the pulling the football away. These are things that were just, to have so many of those hooks was amazing, and a lot of those particular elements, those are the things that I always resonated me with Peanuts, was those things of the fantasy life of Snoopy, and I loved the animations, but I didn't like the animations. I thought there was some sloppiness in the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, and the Christmas special with Charlie Brown. Some odd things happened in the animation. You probably know what I'm talking about, but I just, but those were the times. But to me, it didn't grab me. There was a comic strip called Ricochet, and it was a cowboy.
Yeah, Ricochet, sure.
Yeah, and it was mostly the Sundays. I loved the Sundays because they were bigger, and but the drawings in there were just amazing. I think I was more drawn to the art in comics than I was the writing. We used to read the comics for how they were drawn. But Peanuts didn't seem right to me. They didn't sound like kids to me. They sounded like little adults. And,
which is one of the things a lot of people love about it.
Yes, I know. Exactly. But to me, as a child reading this, I said, nobody talks like this. And Charlie Brown was a big fat whiner. He just annoyed me. He was just a, I love the baseball strips. I love the action when there was action, and there was always action in the baseball strips, and I loved that. But a lot of it was a lot of talking heads, and I think one of the things I didn't like about Peanuts, and it was probably one of the successful marketing plan for Peanuts or strategies, was that it shrunk the comics. It made the comics smaller. That was his selling hook, was the fact that it was 4 panels. They could be linear, they could be 2/2, they could be horizontal and vertical. So it was very versatile, where it could be placed on the comics page and not lose any of the content. But it was very minimal. There's no backgrounds, very little detail. Perspective never changed. It was dull to look at to me. I just never. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to Sparky. Granted, he's probably the greatest cartoonist in the 20th century. But to me, as a kid reading it, it didn't grab me like other strips did.
Well, I think this is so fascinating, particularly if you're coming from an art background as I am and you are. You know, you always gravitate towards the art. And you're looking for stuff, and particularly when you're young, you're
Yeah.
looking for stuff that challenges you as an artist. You know, you want to draw better, so you look at Hal Foster and you know things like that. And Sparky was, you know, Sparky. I can't call him Sparky. I didn't know him, but Charles Schultz went in the other direction. But that was, if you go through the strip, that idea, which I think was a huge part of how it was originally sold, was sort of imposed upon him, you know, by the, first of all, by the syndicate and the newspapers in general, who were moving towards smaller real estate for comics all the way around. You know, editors have always had that
Oh, yeah.
love-hate relationship. So they were moving in that direction. And Sparky's, I gotta stop calling him, he's Mr. Schultz to me.
He preferred
I
it.
know. I just feel I never knew him, and I just don't feel like I can do that. It's anyway. But so aside from that, his style lent itself to that as well. I don't think he would have been able to accommodate that if his style didn't already, you know, suit itself to that and suggest it. And
Yeah,
so
and to that point, you could see some of his early Sunday pages where he would do a lot of detail in the backgrounds. It just didn't seem right. It didn't fit right. It didn't look right. You know, when he had all this, you know, detail, because he could draw. He could draw amazing.
sure,
And but when you look at those early Peanuts Sundays, they didn't quite
yeah,
look right. And he did do
Mhm.
perspective and things like that in those early
yeah,
days. And it was just not feeling the same way as it did now. So, you know, I'm not trying to denigrate his style at all, or, you know, when I say it didn't resonate me, but it did not resonate with me as a kid. You know,
yeah.
as a young child looking at Peanuts and seeing, I mean, to me, Reg Smith and Andy Cap was much more interesting. One, because he was, you know, this alcoholic, you know, wife beating drunk, and but the fact that, you know, I love the art style. I love the way Reg drew, and I liked his humor, and you know, to me that was really interesting. But the Peanuts just didn't jump at me the way. And I know a lot of cartoonists say that the first thing out of their mouths is, you know, who's your influence? They always say Peanuts, and you know, and I try not to. I try not to be sacrilegious. But,
You're a Catholic after all.
I'm an atheist, you know, and I'm an atheist. You know, Peanuts, you know, influencing me, and I know it influenced a lot of people. Done not to, you know, denigrate its importance.
Well, I think it's some of the stuff that you're talking about, you know, Mad Magazine, the irreverence of Mad Magazine,
Right.
the satirical qualities within the cartoonists that you mentioned, the screwball comedy of Bill Holman. You know, that's coming from a very different sensibility than Charles Schultz is coming from.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm more of a. I always was drawn to people who were wise asses. You know, I just like.
Mhm.
I loved Groucho Marx as a kid. I loved watching
Yeah.
Marx Brothers movies, and we were forbidden to watch the Three Stooges.
So you died to.
Yeah, my mother would say, you cannot watch these. They're too violent. But actually, that's where Soup to Nuts comes from. The very first Three Stooges movie was called Soup to Nuts. And it was
Oh
written,
my God, I didn't realize that.
yeah, it was written and produced by Rube Goldberg. It's actually, Rube Goldberg was in the movie. He wrote the movie, and there's a lot of Rube Goldberg contraptions throughout the movie.
Okay, I'm picking my mouth up off the floor right now. That I had no idea of that.
Yeah,
That's
you could actually see it on YouTube. I think you could see the whole movie on YouTube. It's with Ed Healy, and it had Larry Fine, it had Moe, and it had Shemp. It was way pre-Curly. Very bizarre movie, but really fun to watch. And that was the name of the movie. It was called Soup to Nuts. So that's kind of that's why I picked the name. You know, it was just a tribute to a television show or movies that we were forbidden to watch as children.
So you're pointing to all these influences, you know, that are a totally different world, really, than the kind of humor, the character-driven humor, the less wise-ass-oriented humor, the kind of, you know, psychologically based humor that is in Schultz's work is is coming from a very different place. It's like Warner Brothers cartoons. The difference between the directors, that some people love Chuck Jones's cartoons, some people love Bob McKimson's cartoons. It all depends on the sensibility. There's a refined kind of elegance in Chuck Jones's work, and that madcap quality that's in some of the other directors' work is something that other people prefer, And I think it's just a difference in taste. And if everybody was the same, then what a drag it would be.
Well, it's the same with animation. When you mentioned animation, I never liked Disney movies. I just found them boring and insipid. I loved Max Fleischer. I thought Max Fleischer was a much better animator. His stories were better. They were edgy. I mean, those early Popeyes and those Superman cartoons and Gulliver's Travels, they were just absolutely beautifully drawn and done. And to me, Pinocchio and Dumbo and Bambi, they were just, I don't know, milk toasty. I don't know. They just seemed too clean to me. They were just everything wrapped up in a big tight bow at the end. And
you're speaking to my heart now, man, because
yes.
I really, the same thing. Disney movies are beautiful to look at. I mean, in terms of their finish and their polish and their technological achievements are really, inspirational and awesome. The first great flush of Disney feature-length films just knock me out. They're great. But when it comes to cartoons that I want to watch over and over and over again, Fleischer Brothers, number one on the list.
Yeah, I think why they resonated with me is because they're kind of like why Bill Holman resonated with me. There was all these wacky stuff happening in the backgrounds, and Popeye talking under his breath, the things he would say under his breath, not really part of the dialogue, but it was just like the aside stuff would kill me. And the fact that he could punch a pile of wood, it would go up in the air, and a cabin was built right then, fall down, turn into a cabin. I mean, things that didn't happen in Disney movies, things that could not happen didn't happen in Disney movies, where to me, why limit yourself? I mean, this is a cartoon. Anything can happen. I mean,
yes.
It just, and I think the attention to detail in those Supermans just blew me away as a kid. I remember watching how dramatic the lighting was, for one thing, in the Fleischer's Supermans. But the detail, there was a scene where there was a point of view where Clark is talking to Lois, and Clark's sitting at a desk, and you're looking a bird's eye view from behind Clark, and the light's coming a certain way, and there's a shadow to the left, and Clark's head's moving, and when your collar's too tight and your skin kind of folds up a little bit, when you lean your head back. Well, he drew that. He drew this little fold Clark's neck, and it was shadowed, and it was just a tiny little details like that. Just to me, I never really felt it in Disney. And like Lois, there was this one with the mechanical monsters. I don't know if you remember that particular one.
Oh, yeah.
They're looking at the diamonds and everything, and Clark calls out Lois, and you're seeing the scene is the back of her head, and then she turns around really quickly. It's the first time you see Lois in the strip or in this film, and her hair moves, and it moves, and it keeps moving even though her face has stopped. It goes side to side and then settles itself. And the light changed with it as it moved through the light with the shadows would change on her hair. And that detail was just amazing to me as a kid. I don't know, I just saw these things, and it just impressed me. It was like, boy, this is like real life. This is so really well drawn and thought about. And that's why I like Fleischer better than Disney.
Yeah, I also like the urban kind of sensibility that exists in Fleischer. It's a mix of cultures. We're talking about guys, animators, cartoonists who grew up in the city, who grew up on the Lower East Side, who come from an immigrant experience. So they bring all of this kind of humor, the rough and tumble humor that comes out of mixing all of these people from all these different places in the world together. And it's got a punch to it. Disney is the humor in the shorts from the 20s into the 30s before the features. They're funny and clever, but they don't hit home with me because that humor seems to me a little contrived and a little softer. I prefer that kind of rough-hewn kind of quality that exists in Fleischer. And all of the stuff that you're talking about, too, Fleischer cartoons of that particular era really really have this gorgeous attention to detail. The stereooptic process where they filmed in front of actual three-dimensional backgrounds and then superimposed the Popeye figure of Popeye or Olive and Betty Boop or whatever on top of it, created an effect I think is just so remarkable. There's some technical playing around invention in Fleischer that I really enjoyed too. There's a freedom there, I think. And like you said, if you're going to do comics or cartoons, why limit yourself? Why not use everything you can use? And I think Fleischer really tries to do that much more than Disney, at least early on. Disney gets into this realism thing, and they go down that pathway, and it's a fascinating pathway, but it does inhibit you from some of the broader humor and ideas that Fleischer was much, and Warner Brothers were much freer to explore.
Yeah, I agree.
So in your own animations then, you said you're really just starting, you talk like an animator, I have to say. Somebody who loves those little things, those are the things you start to look at and you go, oh God, that's where the life is.
Right, yeah, exactly. But yeah, I just, it was just playing around with it, doing something different, just seeing if I could do this. And each one I do, I learned something from it. Again, self-teaching myself, this program, a very simple iMovie animations. Anything more complicated, it would, I don't know if I have the time or inclination, but.
Let me encourage you to try Procreate. If you haven't already, Procreate 5 has got this. I'm not using the animation tool, but there's an animation assist in it, which a lot of people are starting to play around with. And I think you'd really enjoy that. I'm using Procreate. Previously I'd been doing a lot of paper animation, just old school on animation paper with a pegboard. And a light box. And I love doing that. But in terms of convenience, playing around with Procreate on my iPad is fabulous. You can do brief animations on it, and they can be complex. And you can get them done relatively easily and quickly. And then I move them into Adobe After Effects, which, to play around in there if you want to do other stuff and work out timing more effectively. That's the way to go. It really is. The stuff you're doing now, I think of course, right now it's great the way it is. But if you want to play around with it more, I encourage you to check that stuff out.
I will, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. The one thing I wanted to talk to you about is Catholicism in your work, because we're both, I was raised Catholic too, the same hang-ups.
Yeah, right.
And the same issues. And of course I came out the other end just as you did. You said you're an atheist and I am too. So it's kind of interesting, but Catholicism plays a big part in Soup to Nuts.
Yes, it does. Because I think a lot of the stuff that, as we were growing up, around the dining room table, there was a lot of humor about what happened, in Catholic school and Catholic catechism classes. And so I wanted to incorporate that into my comic strip as well. In fact, I'm actually doing a young reader's novel right now that I'm working on. It's called Confessions of a Catholic Kid. It's more just, designed for my experiences growing up as a Catholic, in the 60s and 70s. And mostly it's essentially from the point of view of a 7-year-old boy who just, doesn't understand, how this works. But it's a humorous look at, growing up Catholic and, the bungling of, of dogma and, misunderstanding certain things and questions. And we used to have, priest would come over and visit the family, and he had an enormous mole on his nose.
Oh God.
And his name is Father Brugger, and we used to call him Father Booger. And and just writing about that kind of stuff, and just how accidentally calling him that. There's another chapter where my mother was always adamant that we went to church, and we had to be represented at church. It has to be at least one Stromoski every Sunday. As it got older, before it was everybody had to go, but in the 70s, my mother was like, we've got to go. We lived like a block or two away from the Catholic church, and she went out to in a driving snowstorm. She was determined to go to mass, and we were standing at the front door watching her try to cross across the yard, and she hit a hole that we had dug and forgot about, and she ended up, face first in this snowbank, and it's actually pretty funny. We thought it was, a bear trap, but at least we knew that the bear trap worked. So those kinds of things, just writing, memories about growing up Catholic. But I think that religion itself is a plethora of comic humor. Because anything that takes itself that seriously, has to be taken a peg down or two, and that just goes to my instincts. Like before, I like things that attacking sacred cows. Just let's poke fun at the things that you're not supposed to poke fun at. That's what makes it funnier.
Well,
because it's taboo.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've gotten all kinds of reactions to your work that deals with religion and specifically Catholicism.
Oh yeah, I pro and con.
Yeah.
Usually, the older the person, the more offended they were. The closer they were to my age or younger, they got it. They understood. And occasionally, I'd hear from a Catholic priest, and they were actually pretty liberal about, they never took offense. They would ask me for the original. And I would just so yeah, that happened quite often. But
so your experience, you went to Catholic school as well?
Only for the first grade. All my siblings went above me, pretty much, in descending order. But at one point, my mother took us all out and put us in public school, which was an interesting thing because just in that 1 year of Catholic school, I was way ahead of I went from first grade to second grade, and when I was in second grade, I was way ahead of pretty much every subject than everybody else, because I think in Catholic school, fear is a great motivator. So,
yeah.
The only something I wasn't good at was science, because they didn't really teach science in Catholic school, because God made everything.
Yeah.
But other than that, I was way ahead of everybody. I was cursive writing.
Well, that's still an issue. Private schools in general. I mean, in terms of, particularly in terms of urban environments, underfunded public schools and private schools that have some advantages, but Catholic schools among them. So a lot of kids who aren't even Catholic.
Well, in my Catholic school, it was pretty crowded. I mean, my class size was 60. We had 6 rows of 10 kids, and we learned. I mean, we learned because we were scared to death.
Yeah.
I mean, it's different. It was different back then. Nuns were disciplinarian. There was corporal punishment. There was just the fear of God, And,
yeah. I remember that too, even though I didn't go to Catholic school, but we certainly got that, Sunday school, we got it in church. Fear was a big motivator back then. It was a big tool in the in the toolbox.
It's confusing, when you're 6 years old. It's like, you're scared to death of this person, but you're supposed to love them. It's just, how does that work? And right in the front of the class, there's this 2-foot statue of a guy nailed to a cross, bleeding from his chest and his head.
Yeah.
And, you're looking at that every day, and it was a confusing matter. And then when you had to leave Catholic school, so you got religion in the Catholic school, but as a Catholic, if you're in a public school, you had to go to catechism. You had to have instruction during the week. So
yes.
Wednesday afternoons after school, you have to go to catechism. And so there are 2 kinds of Catholics. There's a hierarchy. There's the private school Catholics, who are like these upper echelon Catholic kids, and then you had the public school Catholics, which were there was like a caste system. You were a sub Catholic because your parents didn't send you to the Catholic school, so you were treated like that as the nuns. And the nun that I went to for catechism, the year after I left first grade, I had to go to catechism in second grade, was my first grade teacher, Sister Richardine, and she looked at me like I stabbed her in the heart. Like I was now a public school kid. I was, a lower echelon Catholic. It was just the way that she looked at me and treated me. It's just a weird dynamic. It was just, and you keep these things in your memory banks and you write about them as a cartoonist later on. That's how you get back at them. So.
Yeah, exactly. The cartooning is the best revenge, right?
It is.
Yeah, it's interesting how Catholic school went through some changes and sort of fell out of favor even among Catholics after a period of time. There was a lot of discussion and emphasis, I remember, in the early 60s, but it was a big deal for me not to go to Catholic school because my dad and my mom both had. And it was my mother went through some problems with the Catholic Church that had to do with, losing a child and afterwards, and some issues that came up afterwards. So she ended up having she left the church after being somebody who was very, very religious, and it became sort of a point of contention between my folks. We had to keep going to religious ed, or at least I did. My brothers and sisters following me didn't, but it was a big thing having a fallout with the church, and then my mother having problems with it and with the parish that we belonged to, and then my father would take us to church on Sunday. My mother stopped going after a period of time because she had some serious issues with the idea of birth control and the way they treated women in the Catholic Church, and that was a kind of an interesting but also very I guess tumultuous period, the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, it was probably the 70s because that's when my mother kind of like lost her belief system and didn't insist on us going anymore. It was the women's movement that really, I think, affected the Catholic Church and membership in the church for a good number of people.
Sure.
And my mother was a convert. She wasn't born Catholic. She had to become a Catholic in order to marry my father. And she was, and converted Catholics are just the most devout. I mean,
yeah,
he was just completely into it. My dad was like he was like a country club Catholic. He'd go on Easter and Sunday, Easter and Christmas, and pretty much, most of the time, because he would fall asleep in church and start snoring. She just said, you don't have to keep going, but we had to go, and I hated it. I never enjoyed it. I never enjoyed church. I found it a complete and utter waste of time. I remember, especially on nice days, because as a kid growing up, I always wanted to be outside. I just loved being outside. And I remember sitting in church and looking out the windows and looking out the doors, especially if it was a warm day. They would open the side doors, and we had this field out there, and there would be kids out there playing, and you could see the playground a quarter mile away, and there's kids playing. I'm sitting here listening to this dribble and thinking, this just same thing that happened last week. I'm listening to the same shit as last week. It's like we do this every week, and and I felt guilty about it.
Yeah, it doesn't. I'm just sorry. It's just when you say stuff like this, it just resonates with me so much. I because of the same experience, and it just doesn't have any impact or connection to your childhood. To you as a person.
It's weird, and it was just weird things that were going on, and the dreary music. And then the going to receive communion, and the fact that you can't chew it, you had to have it dissolved.
Oh, I hated that.
And it would be stuck to the roof of your mouth until like late that afternoon.
It just made me gag.
Yeah,
every Sunday.
Do you remember? There was a rule. They used to have to you had to fast before the host. You'd have to have an empty stomach.
Yes.
So you could not have breakfast. You could have water or medicine. That's it before you receive communion. It's like, what?
It was awful.
So you always had to go to 7 o'clock mass. So because you're starving, you're just starving. You couldn't chew it, you couldn't touch it. I remember one time, and my brothers were altar boys, and my brother, they would hold the plate underneath your chin. Now they hand it to you and you're allowed to touch it, but back then you weren't allowed to touch the Eucharist at all.
Yeah. That's right.
It was sacred, So my brother, and then I always wonder what the plate was for, because if the priest missed or something, or you dropped it, it would be the plate. And it actually it hit the plate, ricocheted, and hit the floor, and everything stopped. Like everybody was staring at this host, and my brother's standing there holding this, plate on a stick, and Father Duffy's like damning him to hell with his eyes. Jesus is on the ground.
Oh no!
Death is hard stuff like that, and so you can see the opportunity to write about this stuff and the humorous part of it, and and there was always three kinds of priests. There was the father take a nip, who was always a little more consequent, constant, or the wine instead of water. There was the father of fire and brimstone who would just be screaming at you, that you're all going to hell because you don't give it.
We had that one.
Yeah, and then you had Father What a Waste, who was he was the young hip priest that did all the folk masses and all the girls were in love with because he was 26 or something. Oh my God. And he was always on the basketball court with his collar on. Yeah. That kind of, yeah.
Oh my God, it's so perfect because that was our parish too.
That was our parish, and that was there's a drunk guy, there was the angry guy, and there was the cool hippie dippy priest, and all the girls loved him. And there was nuns like that too. There was the nuns that were usually old and wrinkled and just dried up, and then there was the happy big fat nun, and then there was who was always out playing basketball in her full nun outfit. Just she's out there playing basketball, and her
got to admire her.
Her veil is flying around, and she was. It was everybody had that. So
yeah, it was an interesting culture to rebel against in a lot of ways, and a lot. You got to have some of that stuff to bounce off of. As a cartoonist, and I think that one of the things I appreciated in Soup to Nuts is that I don't see that experience in a lot of popular culture these days, reflected in popular culture. But there's, those of us who went through that as kids, it's we don't talk about it a lot, but Soup to Nuts does allow for that to be explored, and I really appreciated that. Even though I survived, Catholicism to become an atheist, it was great to read it in the comic and find a reflection there, of my own experience.
Oh, whenever I did a Sunday page, usually when I talked about religion, it was usually a Sunday page. So whenever I did one of those, it was just my email box would be full. Either with people mad or people saying, "Oh my God, I remember that. I felt the same way," or that sort of thing. I did a comic strip once. I couldn't believe my editor let me do it. Where Andrew walks into the bedroom and he's looking over his shoulder, and Roy Boy's at his desk with his sun lamp, and he's working diligently. And he's saying, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I knocked the crucifix off the wall, and I got to fix it before Mom finds out." So he's got this little brad nail hammer, and he's hammering the nails back into Jesus's hands.
Oh my God!
Like tick 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 tick, and Roy Boy looks up and he says, "I feel like a Roman."
Oh my God!
It actually saw my editor didn't edit it, and surprisingly, I didn't get one email from it.
That's amazing.
I thought I was going to be inundated, but not one. It was just a very
fantastic.
Yeah,
it was also a great comic. It
happened. It was that actually happened. We were always breaking crucifixes or breaking rosaries and having to fix them, and for years I thought I had a spatula around my neck, but it was a scapula. I thought it was a spatula. I had to work that into jokes somehow.
That's great. So, putting that aside just for a moment, the one other thing I wanted to ask you about, obviously, was your experience as president of the National Cartoonist Society.
Oh.
You did that for a couple of years.
Yeah, I was on the board of directors for a long time, probably 10 years. I was initially a second vice president, which means you don't do anything. You just kind of observe and see what's going on. And then I was membership chairman for a while. I was the awards chairman for a while. I was the president. I run the Cartooning for Kids program that they did. I'm on the foundation board right now. But yeah, it was a good experience. One of the things I loved about it, was when I was president, was getting to pick where we went for the Reubens. And
of course,
did a lot of sightseeing trips where we go to a city. And one of the things we used to do, I don't know if we do it now, but it was post 9/11. So hotels were very willing to negotiate because a lot of people travel back then. They just were too frightened. So we used to get really good deals on hotels. So I would go to Chicago and I go to 3 hotels, and I would, really nice, 5 diamond hotels, and they would put me up and wine you and dine you and try to get you to come to their hotel. And
nice.
Same thing in Florida. Saw several hotels in Florida, and they would, they pay all your expenses, and it was fun. It was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun. But president, it's like it's like editors, you can't please everybody in an organization. Someone will always find fault with something you do, and you just got to do your best, and hopefully, things work out. And it's an interesting thing, awards. They're really nice for the moment. They're a great moment, and I think more people should win them because it's really exciting. Because when you're nominated, you're really, the president calls you or writes you a letter and says, you've been nominated for an award, and your heart's pumping. Is, oh my God, that's great. And then you go to the Reubens, and you can't think about anything until the awards night. So you're there, on a Friday, and you're thinking, back of your head, you're thinking, oh, this award's coming up, I hope I win. And then it's the day of the award, and then you do all your seminars in the back of your head. You're still thinking, oh my God, that thing's coming up really soon. And you're getting dressed, you're putting your tuxedo on, you go down, you have the cocktails, and you're trying to be cool, but your heart's, beating. And then you sit down to dinner, and then the awards start. And then your heart's really beating. Look on the program and you see which division, when your division comes up. So if it's first, second, third, or fifth, and your heart's just pounding by the time, they get to your division, and then your name is announced, and they show your artwork up on the screen, and the person opens up the envelope, and they say your name, and that's just an amazing feeling. It's a great feeling, and people are clapping for you, and you walk up, and the spotlight's on you, and you get to say some words, and you thank your wife. And it's a really nice moment, and then it's over, and then you sit down, and they go to the next one, and then it's over. It doesn't do anything really for your career. It doesn't change anything, but it's a nice moment, and it's a very subjective moment. I mean, you understand that you probably, this was given to you because 5 people, thought you were great, that voted for you, and or 10 people voted for you, but it's still a great feeling. It's
Sure.
not to win those awards. But only the first time, because I won 3, and
Wow.
the first one was great. I mean, they were all great. It was an honor. I mean, don't get me wrong, but it was not as exciting as that first one. It's still exciting, but that first one was just fantastic, and it was the first Reuben I ever attended. It was 1996, and I won for greeting cards. I was just really, really. It was just very, very cool. And then you win again. It was still cool, but it's not like that first time. So I think when the NCS votes, they should really do think about, because there's so many talented people out there that should win an award that haven't, and they should have that moment. That's really what it should be about. I mean, it's great and everything, but let's spread the love around a little bit, because those people are deserving as well.
Oh yeah, I think that's one of the downsides of awards. I think you're right. There's so much wonderful. It's so wonderful to be acknowledged, but at the same time, there are so many people who are doing such great work. It's too many people to count, and some of the work just doesn't fit the bill or whatever, for whatever thing it may stand outside of it somehow, and it's equally valuable as anything else, and just somehow it gets overlooked, like something like Bill Holman's work, as you were talking about. Somebody who's doing a comic strip that is maybe a little more eccentric and a little outside the mainstream. Maybe it's not selling as much, but it certainly has value that's equal to other things, and particularly a lot of value because it's coming from a different point of view, and that's really important to celebrate too.
It's not. It's an art award. It's not a sales award, and it's recognized as that. And that's essentially that should be the only criteria.
It's other cartoonists who are voting, right? Just members of the
NCS members vote for all the divisions and the Reuben Award. And one of the things that I'm not saying any of these people are not deserving, but we tend to be insular in who we select for, especially the Cartoonist of the Year. They tend to be syndicated people because they're the most visual. They're the most visual within our industry. But if people sat down and thought about it, and go outside the most obvious ones, that are people that have been overlooked. Charles Adams never won any NCS. Charles Adams, himself.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That
that's an indication of what you're talking about. Absolutely. I mean, hard to think of. But then and that goes to show the limitations of awards and their reach. But Charles Adams, fortunately, didn't need it.
One of the things too is that we tend to not really pay attention to what it means to be the Cartoonist of the Year. And to me, it should be the person who really had the most impact, that year, who did something that was really memorable. And a lot of times they get it right. But one of my complaints is that when Mark Tutuli came out with Leo, his syndicated feature, it was so different and so amazing the year that came out. That was so, to me, Mark should have won that year, and he didn't. And he's been nominated ever since, and it's been like 10 times or something like that now. But Mark should have won, almost immediately, because it was the talk of the industry. It was really an impactful comic strip. Roz Chast, when she came out with her graphic novel, Can We Talk About Something Pleasant? She did win Cartoonist of the Year. That was a year we that was absolutely well deserved. It was a great graphic novel. It was made a huge impact. But there's other cartoonists.
Alison Bechdel.
Alison Bechdel should have won. Not even been nominated. I mean,
ridiculous, really.
People don't look past. If they thought about it, people said, "Hey, what about Alison Bechdel when she did Fun Home?" No, absolutely, it should have been.
Well, and then Dykes to Watch Out For was in alternative newspapers for how long? 20 years or something. Desperate. You really, alternative newspapers, alternative comics. Those are other things. That
Linda Berry's been getting nominated for about three years now. I think she's been nominated. Long overdue.
But absolutely.
She's mostly teaching now, and she's not really publishing. And so she will probably get a Reuben. She did get the Milt Caniff Award, which is a Lifetime Achievement Award. She was probably she's also one of my greatest influences. Her writing, just astonishing to me. Just no cartoonist writes like she does. 1 minute she could have you in hysterics, and then the next comic strip you're crying. I mean, some of her writing has actually got me so very emotional because she touches on things that usually are hidden away, or buried. She can pick scabs. She's good at that. But she's another cartoonist. But that's what these are. They're just awards. They're just recognition for a moment, and you live that moment very briefly, and it's great. I'm really happy for so many of my friends that have won and won awards, and I'm happy the fact that I've had a few already, and that's enough. But we need to spread it out, we need to spread it out some more, because there's some guys and women and men that have just never even been nominated, much less win. And they should have a moment. You should have that moment where everyone's clapping for you and the spotlight's on you and everybody says they love you. That's my feeling.
Well, this has been absolutely terrific, Rick. Really enjoyed speaking with you. It's been this has to be, I think, a record in terms of my interviews so far. I mean, I feel like we could keep on talking, but I have to relieve myself. So I've been drinking hot tea while I'm sitting here, and I'm locked in a closet.
Well, there you go. So, well, on that note, it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it too, and I'm looking forward to looking at your stuff on Instagram. I'll definitely check out your stuff and become a daily watcher of what you're doing. So, and I appreciate you giving me the interview today.
Oh, Rick, it's been a pleasure. I really have enjoyed it. There's so much to talk about, and I hope we get to do it again sometime because I do feel like, I mean, there are a lot of these topics can be explored even further, and it's been such a wide-ranging conversation. And I really enjoyed it, and I hope it brings more people to your Patreon page and support Andrew and keep up with what you're doing, because you're doing a lot of inventive new things and exciting things, and your Instagram feed is one of the joys I have every day. So I really look forward
that's cool of you to say. Keep in touch, and thanks so much for today.
Okay. All right. So that was some conversation. It was great. Wasn't that great? I really had a great time talking to Rick, and I really hope to bring him out to the university to talk to my students at some point in the future. Be sure to go to Patreon. Be sure to give him some support. I think it's really important to, especially when artists and cartoonists are moving out on their own, I think it's really important to try to support them as best we can. So check out Patreon, and if you got an extra $1 to spend and you love Soup to Nuts, be sure to offer your support on Patreon for Rick Stromoski, okay? I was wondering about one of the things that sometimes after, how do I put this? Okay, I'm a Taurus, and I don't necessarily believe in astrology and the signs of the zodiac and all this stuff. But there are some characteristics of the classic Taurus that play out in my temperament, and among those is a kind of slowness. I don't want to say intellectual slowness, but I'm not one of those people who immediately thinks of the response when somebody else is making a point, or I don't always think of, I think of a lot of things after the fact, after a discussion, particularly an interesting discussion, and the discussion we were having about, Rick's tastes versus the tastes of somebody who'd be interested in peanuts, for example, my tastes or whatnot. Although I have to say I share a lot of the same tastes in regard to Mad Magazine, in regard to Smokey Stover and Bill Holman and madcap stuff, silly humor and slapstick humor. I'm a big fan of all of that stuff. Groucho Marx is one of my idols too, in humor. So I get into all that. So I understand, but this is what I was thinking of. That kind of humor is outward, Satire is a kind of outward directed humor. It's directed at the world outside the individual. And one of the things that is true about Schultz's work, Charles Schultz's work, is that it's inward. It's inward directed, and inward directed humor is of a different temperament and explores different issues. Some of those issues may be uncomfortable, but some of those issues may be things that we may not want to grapple with during the day, and some may be impatient with those kinds of issues. And I think, but I do think there's a distinction there between the types of humor, and so some folks have a preference, a taste for outward directed humor and satire, and others have an interest in inward. I don't mean to suggest that they're mutually exclusive. They're not. There can be lots of overlap in varying degrees of satire versus psychological humor, but humorists can find that they lean one way or the other. I think it's always a good thing to find where your real sensibility lies and to kind of go with it. And hey, it all comes down to what you find funny. What the writer finds funny. And that's what they're going to put into their work, right? And I'm not really sure that when Charles Schulz sat down to create Peanuts and develop it over those years, that he knew he was looking inward as much as he was, or that he set out to look inward as much as he did. But he certainly does in the end. Even when it comes to the imaginings of Snoopy, we are talking about a kind of psychology, and the psychology of a particular character, particular being. It's very different than the kind of social satire that one sees in pages of Mad Magazine or in Harvey Kurtzman's Little Annie Fanny or Al Capp's Little Abner, to name a couple of satirical strips from the past. And, and as somebody who is a practitioner of comics, I often think about that. I think about the distinction, and I know it's funny because in my own work I tend to usually, like if you ever read Plastic Babyheads from Outer Space, you probably find that it's a social satire and outward directed. Although I think I appreciate more the comic stylings, the cartoons of someone like the writing of someone like Charles Schulz, which is directed towards the inner self. And it's something I like to think about in my own work and try to improve upon and work towards, because I think it's difficult, but I also think it lasts. It's interesting. It has impact. And not to say that outward directed doesn't either. Like Groucho Marx and Duck Soup, still classic film that has a lot of meaning, at least for me, and today. So anyway, it's just one of those things to ruminate on. I'm just throwing it out there, just some thoughts I had after the fact, and wanted to share them with you. That'll be it for today, I believe. And next time, I think our guest will be Tim Jones, the cartoonist, self-syndicated cartoonist behind the comic strip Sour Grapes, which if you're from Rhode Island, you're probably very familiar with, and it's out in Texas and California too. So it's one of those comic strips that's out and about, but it's in print. And so we'll talk to Tim about his career and his life in self-syndication and what it takes to do that. So for now, I'll say so long. I'll see you next time. Hope you are happy and healthy and well, and thanks for listening. Okay, so just as an example of how bad my business acumen is, I totally forgot to promote myself. Be sure to follow me on Instagram. That's Grogan Jeff on Instagram and whatever. And you know, if you want to know more about me, I'm on. You can go to my website, jeffgrogan.com. Although don't look for anything in the about section, because I really can't stand writing those things. This is who I am, and I've tried, and it just sounds so full of baloney. Anyway, Grogan Jeff, Instagram, lots of pictures, little stuff, folderol, whatever. Check it out. And okay, yeah, that's my self-promotion for this week. Ciao. See you. Bye. Okay, further proof of my incompetence in regard to business and self-promotion. I'm playing I'm playing the edited version of the show for my wife, and we get to the end of the outro and even the part where I interject something about myself, and I think I'm doing a great job. She says, "You haven't even talked about the new strip you're putting up on Instagram. You haven't even mentioned it, and it's been going on for a couple of weeks now." And it's true. I forgot all about it.
You blockhead!
Yeah, okay. Don't do as I do. Do as I say, kids. Okay. I'm. Oh boy, this is bad. Okay, so I'm running samples of a new comic strip. It's called Gladly Yours. It's a riff off of the comic strip I ran on Go Comics for a while called Jetpack Jr. It's about the husband and wife, Hank and Marcia Gladly, and I'm running samples of it right now. I've only done like 6 weeks of it, but check it out. It's important for me, I guess, if you check it out on Instagram. Go back and look at some of the posts, because there's only a couple more weeks of it left. But anyway, check it out and see if you like it. And if you like it, give me a heads up, because I really kind of know. Gotta kind of know. But you know what? Let me know. Grogan Jeff, GROGANGEOFF. Okay, there's my self-promotion. I did it. I talked about my comic strip, Gladly Yours. Check it out. I am doing work. It's out there, and I need your support just like everybody else does. So, see what you can do. Anyway, and remember, Jeff is spelled with a G, not a J. GEOFF. Grogan Jeff. Okay, I got in trouble once when I was a kid. Okay. Did I do a good job? Have I done it now? All right. Am I done? Okay. Yeah. Bye.